Hey everyone, how's it going? Today we're going to be talking about something that actually has some relevance to politics today: congressional investigations. Now, I won't be getting into my personal politics in this video, but in recent memory, congressional investigations into things like Russian collusion, Russian interference, January 6, potential impeachments of multiple presidents. These investigations and hearings have been incredibly prominent in the news and general political discourse. While Congress, on their own, cannot press charges in these investigations, they can recommend charges and pass off information to the appropriate parties, like the Department of Justice. Perhaps more importantly, though, they can drive public discourse and public opinion, presenting evidence or reaching conclusions that can help certain individuals, parties, or causes win in the court of public opinion. When it comes to the operations of the government, having the public on your side can often be the thing that makes or breaks you. Of course, there can be other uses for investigations and hearings. Sometimes they can be quite personal. Not that they would be promoted to the public as being personal, but there are situations where the credible veneer of Congress was used, in all likelihood, for revenge and or personal gain. Our subject for today very well may have been a key part in one of these cases, where its use and eventual failure led to accusations, congressional inquiry, and the downfall of the senator who brought the accusations forward. This is the plane that was a target of that investigation. This is the Hughes XF-11, also known as the XR-11. The man at the center of all of this drama, the man behind the plane, the target of the grudge, and the target of the inquiry, was one of the richest men not only in America but in the world at the time, Mr. Howard Hughes. Born all the way back in 1905, Hughes was the son of Howard Hughes Sr., an inventor and businessman that founded Hughes Tool Company in 1909. Likely influenced by his father, young Hughes displayed significant interest in technology, engineering, science, and in particular, aviation. In fact, Hughes started learning to fly at just age 14 in 1919. After his father died in 1924 of a heart attack, Hughes, then just 18 years old, began what would be a long and successful business career, using his newfound majority ownership in Hughes Tool Company to springboard over into filmmaking, aircraft manufacturing, medical research, and late in life, real estate. Shocking for a rich man, I know. For our topic for today, we'll be focusing in on his aircraft manufacturing venture, Hughes Aircraft Company. Founded in 1932, Hughes's company began in a rented section of a hangar, and their first mission was to build a record-setting aircraft that would break the flight speed record. After 3 years, in 1935, Hughes & Co. had their first aircraft, the H-1, a sleek silver racer that did indeed manage to set a new speed record for a land-based aircraft at 352 miles an hour. For their next aircraft, Hughes Aircraft would create a twin-boom, twin-engine, fighter-bomber type design, which, according to Hughes Industrial Historic District website, was initially constructed to set yet another flight speed record at a blistering 450 miles an hour, which for 1937, when the project started, would be an incredible speed. The resulting design was called the D-2, a plane that looked remarkably similar to Lockheed's P-38. Hughes would claim that Lockheed actually stole the design from him, but Lockheed denied this, of course, and no evidence other than the word of Hughes seems to exist. Regardless, while initially being a venture to hit high speeds, the D-2 would end up being promoted as a multi-role fighter-bomber, anywhere from a fighter to an escort to a convoy fighter to a light or medium bomber. Much like the P-38, funnily enough, the D-2 would be envisioned as a sort of do-it-all type plane. Despite his high ambitions, the plane was quickly the target of scrutiny and mockery, both for Hughes's gumption and zeal, and for the plane being made largely of Duramold, a wood-plastic type product. Unfortunately for Hughes, the D-2 took quite a long time to construct, likely due to Hughes himself wanting it to be perfect, and it wouldn't be until 1943 that the D-2 would fly for the first time. The results of that flight were rather disappointing. Now, allegedly, the plane never actually flew in the first place, but for the sake of the story, we'll assume that Hughes wasn't lying and the plane did indeed fly. Even then, its top speed did not hit 450 miles an hour, and put quite simply, the plane was a poor flyer. However, likely due to Hughes's money and clout, the D-2 wouldn't end here. In mid-1943, the U.S. military would begin a search for a new aerial reconnaissance aircraft, and along with all of the other major companies, Boeing, Lockheed, Douglas, etc., Hughes Aircraft Company would be toured and inspected, hoping to find a suitable aircraft for this role. Now, whether by sheer luck or the fame of Howard Hughes, the man that would be touring Hughes aircraft for the U.S. military would be none other than the son of President FDR, Colonel Elliot Roosevelt. Luckily for Hughes in this situation, while the D-2 wasn't that great of a plane and may or may not have ever actually flown, he did have a man named John Meyer who worked public relations for him. Meyer knew a bit about the young Roosevelt and locked in on one specific thing: his love of women. Elliot was single and Meyer and Hughes had connections, so when Elliot came to Hughes Aircraft, he would initially be met not with a technical demonstration of the D-2 or a grand impressive tour of Hughes's factory, but rather with a so-called quote-unquote boob buffet, a small group of voluptuous women that would entertain him. In addition to the paid-for eye candy, some well-known actresses, probably known to Hughes through his filmmaking ventures, would join in the wooing of Elliot. Elliot would become particularly smitten with an actress named Faye Emerson, whom he would soon marry in 1944. After this wooing, Elliot would take a tour of the factory and the D-2, whose precise and pristine construction apparently also impressed Elliot. After the tour and leaving Hughes Aircraft and flying back over to New York, Meyer and Emerson would join up with Elliot for more company, wining, and dining. So it's rather obvious that Elliot was being buttered up here, with the women and the entertainment serving as a sort of bribe that would hopefully push him to promote and recommend the D-2 for production. And it worked. Elliot would recommend to the Air Corps that 100 D-2 aircraft, to be renamed the XF-11, be ordered for production. It seems as though Elliot simply could not resist the call of boobs. But anyway, because the production and testing of the D-2 had been rather shrouded in mystery and was the subject of ridicule, it seemed off to many in the military that this small company, with effectively one successful plane they made nearly a decade ago, would be recommended for an order of 100 aircraft. Even if the prototype worked, it was up for debate whether or not the small company could produce 100 aircraft in a reasonable time frame. But probably because Elliot was the president's son, his word and opinion had extra weight, and in October 1943, a contract for 100 models for a price tag upwards of $48 million, over $800 million in today's money, was offered to Hughes. With a contract now offered, Hughes would personally oversee the construction and design of his new child. Measuring in at a colossal 19.9 meters long, 30.9 meters wide, and 7.1 meters tall, the XF-11 was both a string bean and a mammoth. It's like the Kevin Durant of the aircraft world. Because of the model now being a reconnaissance plane, the greatest priority would be range, where it would use its sheer size to store a great deal of fuel. The estimated range of the XF-11 would be around 5,000 miles. Not only focused on range, though, outfitted with two Pratt & Whitney R4360 engines, each driving a pair of contra-rotating propellers, the estimated top speed would be 450 miles an hour, much like the D-2. The XF-11 would have some competition for the same role, but overall it, on paper, was probably the best. Two of its competitors, the F-15A Reporter and the XF-12 Rainbow, both had inferior range and a lower service ceiling. The Rainbow did have a greater top speed, though. As production and design on the XF-11, along with another project of Hughes, the H-4, progressed, his involvement began taking a toll on his physical and mental health. Hughes would personally oversee a great deal of the designing and construction of the two aircraft, spending hours and hours every day poring over every little detail of his two planes. He began eating dinner away from his family, holed up alone in a separate room, likely continuing to pore over details of both aircraft. Then, when the U.S. government threatened to pull funding for the H-4, along with there being some internal drama regarding executive positions and future control over Hughes aircraft, Hughes ended up having a full-blown nervous breakdown. The combined stresses of everything he was involved in, and how deeply he was involved in them, just took too much of a toll on him. To get himself right, in late 1944, Hughes contacted an assistant of his and told him that he was just taking some time off for a while. He would be gone for 11 months, with no apparent contact with his companies and his projects in that time span. It wouldn't be until September 1945 that Hughes would return. In his absence, work on the XF-11 would continue under the guidance of Charles Perrell, who Hughes hired to take some of the load off his plate, and to entice Perrell, Hughes offered him just about total control over the project and of the day-to-day runnings of the company. However, without Hughes in the office, Perrell ran into trouble with the various mechanics and engineers of Hughes Aircraft. Likely used to Hughes taking a great deal of the workload for himself, Perrell struggled to instill a more strict work culture, and this struggle led to severe delays in the construction of the 100 planes they were contracted for. By the time Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, and the European theater of the war ended, just two prototype XF-11 aircraft were near completion. With one half of the war over, the contracts for a great deal of new designs and prototypes would end up getting canceled, and the XF-11 was not spared. It wouldn't be canceled outright, though, as the two prototypes were granted permission to be finished, but the 98 other models were canceled. Thus, in his absence, Hughes had gained two almost complete planes, but effectively lost another 98. I should also mention here that if you want more information about all that was going on with the company drama and Hughes' spiral into a nervous breakdown, I recommend the books Hughes, The Private Diaries, Memos, and Letters, and also Empire, The Life, Legend, and Madness of Howard Hughes. But anyway, though, with the two aircraft nearing completion, Hughes had a golden opportunity to put his love of flying to use and take his XF-11 to the air for its maiden flight over Culver City, California. Now, this probably wasn't a great idea, But he really wanted to do it, so on July 7th, 1946, the XF-11 would embark on its maiden voyage. And what a voyage it was, a fiery, almost deadly voyage. Shortly into the flight, there was a problem. Hughes noticed that the landing gear had not fully retracted, and it took a few minutes of him fiddling with the controls for the warning light in the cockpit to turn off. After a bit over an hour in the air, with all seemingly going well, disaster struck. Suddenly, the XF-11 started pitching to the right. An oil leak led to a failure in the right propeller system, and the XF-11 was losing altitude rapidly. With no way to make it back to the airfield, Hughes decided that the best course of action was to crash land at the nearest open field that was available to him, which was the LA Country Club. However, with the plane still losing altitude, Hughes would never make it there, and the plane crashed in a neighborhood in Beverly Hills, damaging 2 houses and destroying a third. Making things worse, the fuel tanks on the XF-11 exploded, nearly killing Howard Hughes. Hughes managed to escape the cockpit and crawl his way out onto the wing before he was pulled away by a Marine who just so happened to be nearby. Hughes ended up suffering several broken ribs, a punctured lung, a broken collarbone, and third-degree burns. Amazingly, though, less than a year later, on April 5th, 1947, Hughes had recovered enough to take the second prototype for a spin, much to the annoyance of the military and those around him. Unlike the first flight, though, the second one went off with no real issues, and both the plane and Hughes survived. The results were that the XF-11 controlled well at high speeds, but suffered from stability issues at low speeds. Ultimately, the thing that got the project killed was its cost. Compared to its competitors, the F-15A and the XF-12, the XF-11 was just much more expensive. And with that cost in mind, the potential performance gains did not justify that cost. Instead of the XF-11, the F-15A and some converted B-50 bombers were selected for use as recon aircraft. The XF-11 would sit in storage as a maintenance training aircraft until late 1949, where it was likely scrapped. Still, there's one last thing to cover. A few months before the second flight in 1947, the XF-11, the H-4, and Hughes himself were the subject of a congressional investigation and a public hearing. On the surface, the reason was that the newly elected Republican Senate was investigating possible waste and/or fraud pertaining to contracts given out during the war. Who better a target than Hughes Aircraft, who was awarded nearly $1 billion in today's money, only to make no planes for the war. While accusations of monetary fraud, government waste, and/or bribery would be the stated reasons for the investigation, the truth of the matter was that Hughes had control of the airline company TWA, and TWA had received contracts for international routes that normally would have gone to Pan American. Pan Am wanted control over these international routes, and they had influence within the Republican Party, so they would push for a bill that would effectively wrestle control of those routes back over to Pan Am. In part because of the influence of Hughes, that bill failed, and a subsequent bill that would attempt the same thing also failed. This angered Senate Republicans, so effectively in an effort to get back at him and increase the power of moneyed interests, it seems time is a flat circle, an investigation into Hughes and the government contracts was opened, with Senator Owen Brewster playing a leading role. Note, Owen Brewster has no relation to the Brewster Aircraft Company. In particular, the committee zeroed in on Hughes and his lackey Myers, wooing Elliot Roosevelt to the tune of nearly $3 million in today's money. When the public hearing started on July 28th, 1947, Hughes, not at the public hearings at this time, would release a flurry of articles and accusations through newspaper magnates that he was friends with. Hughes accused Brewster of being in the pocket of Pan Am and only doing this investigation to promote the interests of Pan Am. Now, to be entirely honest, both sides here did kind of have a point. Hughes and Co. did effectively bribe Elliot Roosevelt, but Brewster and the investigators were basically in the pocket of Pan Am. An investigation that, in a vacuum, was kind of justified, but was being done for personal gain, not justice. A few days later, in August, Hughes himself would take to the stand in the hearings, and to put it mildly, he absolutely obliterated the investigators. The crowd that was attending the hearings was fully behind Hughes, and Hughes managed to flip the script and get Brewster to answer questions on the witness stand, where his more elusive answers earned him no favors. When the investigation concluded, on November 22, 1947, the Senate investigators released a scathing report, but no charges came out of it. Again, no charges were filed, and Hughes walked away with the American public on his side. The investigation had utterly failed, and this failed investigation was in part what caused Owen Brewster to lose his next election. Still, despite Hughes walking away effectively unscathed, that didn't change the fact that the XF-11, his pride and joy, had been a complete failure. Effectively an upscaled P-38, or perhaps an upscaled P-61, the thing that doomed it was probably the fact that Hughes Aircraft didn't have that much experience or the resources necessary to produce aircraft on any sort of scale. It seems as though Hughes Aircraft was basically a hobby project that spilled over into the military realm. But I guess if nothing else, the story of the XF-11, the bribing of Elliot Roosevelt and his love of boobs, and the investigation of that utterly failing is rather interesting. So if you do take away anything from this, just remember, Elliot Roosevelt loved boobs. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. I found out in researching stuff for this video that there was a Martin Scorsese movie about Hughes called The Aviator. I've never heard of this movie before, but I'm not much of a movie guy. Personally, I like to say, name a movie, I haven't seen it. In the vast majority of cases, it's true, even the popular classics. It's a great way to annoy people. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.